Hello and welcome to today's session. My name is Ken Muraguri. I'm a verbal trainer with the Kenya Airlift program. Today we'll be dealing with a question type in critical reasoning, which is identifying the reasoning used in stimulus. So these questions are mostly classified as medium or hard questions, meaning that you will rarely find them in the lower tier of difficulty, that is the easier questions. So they are not usually very common, but they require the identification of the logic behind an argument or an hypothesis. So basically you'll be provided with an argument that contains a set of premises, and then you'll have some kind of logic linking the two. Then you are required now to identify how this logic connects to the conclusions. So some of the features are you will have a premise. So this is kind of introduction to whatever information that you have. You have the analysis or the logic, and then you will have the argument. So mostly you'll find two arguments, and these two arguments will be kind of have opposite conclusions. They may share some premises, but the analysis or the logic behind the arguments will change. So how do you handle these questions? So for every argument provided, so make sure that you first identify if there is one argument or more than one argument. And wherever you find an argument, first try to understand what the argument or the conclusion implies and the logic behind it. So we are saying the what, that's the conclusion or argument, and the why. So why did the author conclude that way? And then you identify its features. So meaning identify the premise, the conditions, if any, and the conclusion. And then finally identify the contradictions or differences. As we said, these arguments will have differing endpoints. So just identify the contradictions or differences. Is there a difference in premise that is introduced? Is there a difference in logic? Is there a difference even in conclusion? So just note those differences. And then when you go to the answer choices, you'll be able to identify, because the question will be asking you to identify how the logic is changing. So very important, if any feature is mentioned in an answer choice, say you have conclusion mentioned, or you have condition, or you have maybe premise, ensure that you identify whatever premise is being talked about in the stimulus. Sometimes you'll find that the GMAT have just changed this premise, and if the author maybe changed a condition, and then you find that the answer choice insinuates that the premise is the one that has been changed. So make sure that wherever you find a feature mentioned in your answer choice, you go back to the stimulus, ensure that it's placed correctly, and then make your judgment on the validity of that answer choice. And as we always say, use process of elimination. Make sure that you find 4 errors, and the one answer choice that you pick should be supported by your stimulus. So with that said, we can try out an example. You can go ahead and pause, and then when you're done, just unpause and we'll discuss it. So in this example, we have an advertiser and a consumer. So the first part says that we have a conclusion here that consumers benefit economically from advertising. We have our what? And then the how is that because of the advertisements, so the advertisers pay the newspapers and magazines, hence they can afford to sell the newspapers or the magazines at a lower price to them. So that benefits now the consumer. But the consumer argues that the advertising is paid by the consumer when the advertiser passes on the advertising budget. So our question is, which of the following best describes how the consumer counters the advertiser's argument? So let's look at our answer options. So option A, by alleging something that, if true, would weaken the plausibility of the advertiser's conclusions. So we see by alleging something. So what is the consumer alleging in the first place? So that the consumers pay for the advertising when the advertisers pass along advertising costs. So that's what they are alleging. So if this is true, would weaken the plausibility of the advertiser's conclusions. So the conclusion of the advertiser is consumers benefit economically from advertising. So is this true or not? So this is actually seems true, because if it's true that the consumers pay for that advertising through higher prices of the products, that means they actually do not benefit economically. So this makes sense. B, by questioning the truth of the purportedly factual statement on which the advertiser's conclusion is based. So what is this factual statement that the consumer questions the truth of? Remember, the consumer doesn't question the first part, which is what the advertiser mentioned as factual or presented as facts. They just question the advertiser's conclusion. Now they introduce another premise that challenges this conclusion. So B is out. C, by offering an interpretation of the advertiser's opening statement, which is this, that if accurate shows that there is an implicit contradiction in it. We know that's not true. We know that there is another premise that was introduced. D, by pointing out that the advertiser's point of view is biased. We do not see any evidence of that, so D is automatically out. E, by arguing that the advertiser too narrowly restricts the discussion to the effects of advertising that are economic. So note that we see the advertiser focusing on the economical benefits to the consumer, and the consumer also focuses on the economic problems that the consumer faces due to advertising. So actually, even the consumer focuses on the economic side of advertising. So E is not correct, so it's out. And our answer is A.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstake America. Upstake America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstakeamerica.com. Upstake America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential.
For our second example, please go ahead and pause, try it on your own, and then we'll discuss the question. So in this example, we have the professor saying, so in this example, we can see now it's a professor presenting the findings of the argument of a marine biologist, and then at the end presenting their own view of the situation. So the marine biologist argues that transmission of sea lice from farm salmon to wild salmon is unlikely in this area of British Columbia, citing numerous studies suggesting that salinities less than 30 parts per thousand are unfavorable. Then concludes that archipelagos 25 to 30 parts per thousand salinity between March and June tends to suppress sea lice. So what is the biologist's argument in the first place? So we want to know how the professor attempts to undermine the biologist's argument. So we see the argument there that this transmission is unlikely in the Broughton Archipelago, British Columbia area. And then the professor's view is that, but a review of the literature shows that these salinities, which 25 to 30 is, includes, of course, less than 30 parts per thousand, in combination with British Columbia's cool spring temperature, favor the flourishing of sea lice. So the view of the professor is that these range in salinities and the cool spring temperatures favor the flourishing of the sea lice. And that, of course, contradicts the view of the marine biologist. So going on to our answer options. A, pointing out that a condition claimed to be necessary for sea lice survival is not sufficient for it. So what condition was mentioned by the marine biologist to be necessary for sea lice survival? Remember here, the marine biologist said that the transmission is unlikely, citing numerous studies suggesting one, salinities less than 30 parts per thousand are unfavorable. So whatever condition that was mentioned is unfavorable, not a necessary condition for survival, but an unfavorable. It's kind of the opposite. So we know that the professor doesn't point out that a condition the marine biologist claimed to be necessary is not sufficient. So actually, the marine biologist did the opposite. A is out. B, citing studies that suggest that salinity levels were not measured reliably. So this is not correct because the studies that the professor cited mentioned 25 to 30 parts per thousand of salinities, which even the studies that the marine biologist mentioned are less than 30 parts per thousand. So it's kind of like using the same studies but different arguments. So the professor never insinuated that the salinities were not measured reliably. C, claiming that there is evidence showing that one of its premises is false. So remember, the premises of the marine biologist argument is that the salinities less than 30 parts per thousand are unfavorable. Hence, it tends to suppress sea lice proliferation. But the evidence that the professor presents is that in reviews, these salinities, same salinities that the marine biologist mentioned, and another one, so the spring temperatures, favor the flourishing of sea lice. So this directly contradicts one of the premises here. So this is actually okay. D, because from this premise is where the marine biologist now formed the argument that the transmission is unlikely in this area. D. Questioning the reliability of the biologist's scientific sources. We have seen that they use the same information but different conclusions, so this is not the case. And then E, showing that its conclusion is inconsistent with its premises. So we see, of course, that the premises, so 1, salinity is less than 30 parts per thousand are unfavorable, and 2, because the 25 to 30 parts per thousand salinity range is unfavorable, it tends to suppress sea lice, hence transmission is unlikely. Actually, the premises and the conclusion are at par, so they make sense. It makes sense to draw the marine biologist conclusion from the premises. But what the professor does is introducing proof that one of the premises is false. But as the marine biologist premises they are actually consistent, so he is out and this is the answer. So as I mentioned earlier, these kind of questions are usually medium or high difficulty, so you'll rarely find them if you do not hit that difficulty level in verbal. But just understanding what exactly is being mentioned, if you see a feature, you go back and make sure that it's the correct feature and the correct analysis of that feature. Just doing that and making sure that you understand the stimulus completely before going on to the question will help you effectively answer this kind of critical reasoning questions. So that's it for our lesson today. Please join us in our next lesson for more verbal reasoning tips. Bye.